Situated in South County Carlow on the River Barrow with majestic views of the Blackstairs Mountains, Borris House is one of Ireland's most important country houses. Seat of the MacMurrough family, who have lived on the site since the 15th century, it is one of the very few remaining great houses of Ireland that is still occupied by the family for whom it was built. With much of its original furniture, paintings, documentary archives, heirlooms and artefacts intact, it's very much a living history. The story of Borris House and the MacMurrough is a story of constancy, adaptation and change that embodies and reflects the course of Irish history throughout the ages. In 1814, the family commissioned an illustrated book to document the family's lineage. It traces their origins back to the Scythians, a nomadic tribe of horsemen who occupied areas of modern-day Iran from the 17th century BC. It is believed that a branch of the Scythians travelled through Egypt, Spain and on to Ireland, and from this branch sprang the 5 ruling monarchs of ancient Ireland, one of whom was known as Murrocha, the 11th century king of Leinster. The family name of MacMurrough is from the Gaelic, son of Murrocha. Murrocha's grandson was a man that every schoolchild in Ireland has heard about, the infamous Dermot MacMurrough, the man who is accredited with the role of bringing the Normans to Ireland. He was King of Leinster from 1126 to 1171, reigning for 45 years at a time when clans and chiefs were constantly at war vying to hold on to their own lands, resulting in many battles, abductions and power struggles. After a bitter feud with a neighbouring chief, Dermot was exiled in 1167. He had lost all his lands, and in desperation to recover his kingdom, he sought allies in Ireland and neighbouring Wales, finally gaining the support of Strongbow, a powerful Norman lord. In return for Strongbow's assistance, he offered his sworn allegiance to King Henry II and the hand of his daughter Aoife in marriage. This marriage has been made all the more iconic in the Irish psyche due to the magnificent painting The Marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, painted in 1854 by the artist Maclise. It hangs today in the Irish National Gallery in Dublin. History has not been kind to Dermot, but in his favour it can be said that he was a prolific patron of the church. He founded many abbeys, such as Baltinglass, Kilkenny, Glendalough, St Mary's in Ferns, County Wexford, where he was actually later buried along with his son Donal. Ferns at that time was a national centre of ecclesiastical importance and indeed the main seat for the kings of Leinster. Throughout the family's history, the MacMurrough have been both pragmatic and strategic in their approach to holding on to their lands, either allying themselves with or fighting against the invading authorities. Following Dermot's death in 1171, his eldest son Donal Kavanagh was proclaimed King of Leinster by the Irish clans, and Donal's successors continued to be recognised as the leading family in Leinster by the other Irish clans, and continued to claim the kingship of Leinster right up into the beginning of the 17th century. However, their territories were under constant threat, initially from the Normans and then later from the English. Dermot's most dynamic successor was Art MacMurrough, who became King of Leinster in 1375. He attacked the English with such frequency, inflicting defeat after defeat upon them, that in 1394 King Richard II himself came to Ireland to try and resolve the issue. A French clerk, Jean Breton, who accompanied Richard II to Ireland, wrote a description of the meeting which took place between Art MacMurrough and Thomas, Earl of Gloucester. I beheld MacMurrough and a body of the Irish more than I can number descend the mountain. He rode a horse without a saddle, which was so fine and good that it had cost him, they said, 400 cow. In coming down, it galloped so hard that in my opinion I never in all my life saw hare, deer, sheep or any other animal run with such speed as it did. In his hand he bore a great long lance, which he cast with much skill. He was a fine large man, wonderfully active. To look at he seemed very stern and savage, and an able man. Art MacMurrough was buried in St Mullins, and his funeral procession was said to have stretched the 6 miles from New Ross to the graveyard. In the Annals of the Four Masters, Art MacMurrough is described as a man who had defended his own province against the English and Irish from his 16th to his 60th year, a man full of hospitality, knowledge and chivalry. There are a few surviving objects from this era that were kept at Borris and passed down through the generations for safekeeping. Among them, the Kavanagh charter horn, dating back to the early 12th century. The charter horn is the only surviving artefacts recognised as the personal property of an Irish king, and therefore is of great historical significance. Today, it can be seen in the National Museum of Ireland. Art's son Donogh married Evelyn Butler, a sister of James Butler, the 4th Earl of Ormond of Kilkenny Castle. This marriage began an alliance between the MacMurrough Kavanaghs and the well-connected, wealthy Butler family that was to last for several hundreds of years. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII declared himself King of Ireland, and thus began the Tudor conquests of Ireland, which resulted in the first of the plantations, when lands occupied by Gaelic clans and Norman dynasties were confiscated and colonised by settlers from England. This was followed by the penal laws, whereby, amongst many other things, Roman Catholics were restricted from owning land. By 1570, Brian Kavanagh had made Borris his primary residence. During the penal law times, the family, although Catholic, managed to avoid losing their estates by bringing up just one of their sons, usually the eldest, as a Protestant. Brian's grandson, Morgan Kavanagh, married Mary Walsh of Piltown, an heiress, and it was her wealth which allowed Morgan to rebuild Borris House extensively in 1731. Morgan's grandsons were Charles, who became Governor of Prague in 1766, Henry, who was a Roman Catholic priest, and Brian, who was the heir to Borris House. Brian married Lady Margaret Butler, and indeed the next 3 successive generations of Kavanaghs were to marry daughters of the Butler family. Brian's son Thomas Kavanagh was only 13 years old when his father died, and in the Kavanagh archives there is a series of letters and papers concerning his religion. He was the underage heir of a Catholic landowner, and the Lord Chancellor of Ireland decided that Thomas should be brought up a Protestant. Thomas was sent to Westminster School, where he was given a Protestant education. This, however, failed to influence him, and he remained a Catholic. Thomas married Lady Susanna Butler, and he gave his sons a very Catholic education in Liège in Belgium, at a time where under penal laws it was forbidden to travel to the continent to receive a Catholic education. During the 1798 rebellion, the house was subjected to an assault by about 300 rebels, hoping to find weapons on the estate. Walter Kavanagh, the eldest son of Thomas and Susanna, was prepared for trouble, and he had gathered up many local tenants who had remained loyal to him. Walter wrote to his brother-in-law at the time, explaining that although the turf and coal houses were set on fire and efforts were made to bring fire up to the house under cover of a car, these attempts were unsuccessful and the house was left mostly unscathed. Walter was the driving force for much change in Borris. He wished to give more tangible evidence of his family's long Gaelic history. He was responsible for commissioning the illustrated volume tracing the family's lineage. He instated the family crest and coat of arms. The family motto is peace and plenty. The crest at the top of the shield is a sheaf of wheat signifying plenty, with the crescent moon signifying peace. In a nod to his Irish heritage, Walter had the motto written in Irish, Síochána agus Farsana. His biggest undertaking, though, was the transformation of Borris House from an early Georgian building into a far grander edifice. The house was given a Tudor Gothic exterior and a richly classical interior under the direction of the great Cork-born architect Sir Richard Morrison and his son William Vitruvius Morrison, who were responsible for designing and altering houses such as Fota House in Cork and Kilruddery House in Bray, to name but a few. Externally, the Morrisons added several flourishes to give a vaguely Tudor style, adding the arcaded porch on the entrance, and decorated the windows with rectangular hood moulds, each of which is finished with the head of a king or queen, a reference to the family's royal heritage. The chapel adjoining the house was also commissioned by Walter. Inside the house, the Morrisons created an exuberant series of rooms, beginning with the most elaborate room, the entrance hall, where the Morrisons created a circle within a square space with the clever use of scaglioli columns and a richly modelled plasterwork. The ceiling is like a great wheel, and the plasterwork is profuse with festoons, flowers and eagles with outspread wings. The drawing room is double-apsed with a trellis pattern. The chapel, which is in the same Tudor Gothic mode as the stair hall in the main house, has a plaster rib vaulted ceiling. Walter died a bachelor in 1818, and it was his brother, Thomas, who oversaw the completion of Walter's vision for Borris. In 1825, Thomas married Lady Harriet Lepore Trench, daughter of the Earl of Cloncarty. Harriet's family were Low Church evangelists, and it was Harriet who put an end to the Kavanagh's hot and cold relationship with the Protestant Church. Thomas converted on their marriage. Thomas and Harriet had 3 sons, Charles, Thomas and Arthur, who was born disabled, and one daughter, Harriet, known as Hoddy. Lady Harriet was an intrepid traveller, making journeys to Constantinople, the Black Sea, the Holy Land and Egypt, as well as Corfu and Albania. Places well off the standard itinerary of the traditional grand tour of Europe, and decades before travel was in any way a luxurious experience. Harriet kept a sketchbook during her travels. These sketches and paintings are a valuable insight into her experience. Some of her paintings hang today in Borris. She travelled at a time when very few women did, and remarkably on her most ambitious journey through Egypt and the Holy Land, she had 3 of her children in tow, one of whom, Arthur, was physically disabled. Harriet and her children all kept diaries, leaving for their descendants today a very rich record of their journeys and indeed their lives. One of Harriet's legacies was the establishment of Borris Lace as a means for creating a source of income for local women during a time when Ireland was being ravaged by the famine. Borris Lace was a very successful little industry. It was sold in London, New York, Paris and Moscow, and even presented to Queen Victoria. It could be argued, though, that Lady Harriet's most successful legacy was the extraordinary way in which she reared her youngest son, Arthur. Arthur was born with tetraamelia syndrome, a condition that meant he was born without limbs. Lady Harriet had a very modern approach to parenting Arthur. She wanted him brought up no differently than her other children. He learned to ride a pony using a specially adapted saddle, to shoot and fish, to write holding a pen in his mouth, and all the other things that children of Arthur's background would have been taught. Lady Harriet instilled in Arthur the belief that his disability could be his strength in life. She also believed that travel was an essential part of a young man's education, and in 1849 she sent Arthur, aged 17, and his brother Tom, along with their tutor, on a most remarkable journey. They travelled from Sweden to St. Petersburg, across the Caspian Sea and on to modern-day Iraq and Iran, and from there to Bombay. Thanks to their diary keeping, there survives today many extraordinary stories of the adventures they had along the way. From St. Petersburg, where they lived the high life, to being imprisoned in a cage in a town square in northern Iraq, or when Arthur fell ill and awoke to find himself being nursed by a woman in a Persian prince's harem. They arrived in Bombay on the 5th of January 1851, when unfortunately Tom contracted TB and later died. Arthur remained on in India alone, and in order to make ends meet, he got himself a job as a postal dispatch rider, which was physically a very arduous and dangerous job for even an able-bodied person. Arthur stayed on in India for 2 more years until he received news that he was needed back in Borris. His older brother Charles had tragically died in a fire, and Arthur's father Thomas had died the previous year in 1852, and so at the age of 22 Arthur found himself the heir to Borris. It was in the role of landlord that Arthur was truly to excel. He was a landlord in the tradition of the old Irish chiefs, believing in his rights as the landlord but also in his duty to his tenants. The Ireland Arthur returned to from India was a land that had been ravaged by the famine. Yet during Arthur's time as landlord, the town of Borris prospered. He developed sawmills and lime kilns in order to rebuild many of his tenants' holdings, and was responsible for building much of Borris village. His designs for the upper cottages in Borris won him a medal from the Royal Dublin Society. He brought the railway to Borris and built the viaduct at a huge personal expense. But it was to greatly improve the lives of his tenants, giving them the ability to bring their goods directly to market. 1855 he married Frances Mary Ford Letherley. It was a happy marriage and Arthur was a devoted family man. They had 3 sons and 3 daughters. When Arthur was 35, he was elected MP for Wexford and then later for Carlow. And whenever Parliament met, Arthur would sail his schooner, the RYS Eva, from New Ross across the Irish Sea and up the Thames to Westminster. A servant then rowed him across the river and carried him into Parliament to his seat. Westminster had never seen anything like it. His maiden speech in Westminster made such an impact that the London newspapers of the time reported on it. They reported that the effect of his words were electrical, and in an instant every eye in the house had turned towards him. Arthur's speech covered his own experiences of the poor laws and the need for legislation to protect tenants. At the conclusion of his speech, Arthur was loudly cheered. However, Arthur's paternalistic approach to being a landlord was to come under attack in the land wars of the 1870s, and more his politics seemed outdated. Indeed, his own son and heir, Walter Kavanagh, disagreed with his father's politics and sided with John Redmond's Nationalist Party. Throughout his life, Arthur continued to shoot, fish, sail and travel and lead a very active life. He wrote and published a book called The Journal of the RYS Eva, a travelogue about a shooting cruise along the coast of Albania. But for many people in Borris, their memories of Arthur were of him sitting under an old oak tree in the courtyard of Borris House, where he would meet his tenants administering justice, listening to people's grievances, and even arranging marriages. Arthur's self-belief and self-discipline were really quite extraordinary. When one reads through his diaries, his enthusiasm and love of life just jumps from the pages. He rarely mentions his disabilities and the difficulties that he surely must have had to endure. It's as if he just didn't see his disability as an issue at all. Arthur died on Christmas Day in 1889 of pneumonia. He is buried in the family cemetery in Borris, and to this day remains a source of inspiration to many. Arthur's son Walter represented Carlow as an MP. He believed in Home Rule and was a member of the Reform Association, which advocated a limited devolved self-government for Ireland. He was also a supporter of the establishment of Catholic University of Ireland. Many of the older generation in Borris today would still remember Walter's son Arthur, who was always referred to as the Major. Having served at that rank in the British Army, he was awarded the Military Cross for his role in the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I. The last of the Land Acts of 1933 saw the breaking up of the Kavanagh estate. This brought to an end this ancient territory which had covered parts of Carlow and Wexford. In 1974, Andrew Kavanagh inherited Borris and along with his wife Tina embarked on its restoration, which today is being continued by their son Morgan and his wife Zara, the present-day custodians of Borris House. Morgan and Zara's vision for Borris today is to open the house and all its history to you, the visitor, and they would like to thank you for being part of what is the story of Borris House.